There's a lot going on today with the reading and all kinds of other things, but I want to start with one of my favorite subjects since I have a captive audience here, which is the calendar. I love talking about the calendar. So we're now in the second Sunday after Pentecost, and for those of you who keep score on where we are in the church year, we are not in a season. We're simply in this period of time after the celebration of Pentecost. The green vestments tell us that we're not in a season of any kind. We are in what, in some parts of the church, is referred to as ordinary time, regular time. Our next season of the church is Advent, which will come closer to Thanksgiving time for us. So we've got a big stretch, almost half the year, you might say. We'll start clocking these Sundays after Pentecost as we move through the summer and into the fall and beyond. But the year is divided kind of into two main halves. The first half is the story of Jesus. We start getting ready for Christmas and through Easter and up to Pentecost. But the second half of the year traditionally is understood as being about the life of the Christian, the life of you and me, which is a really nice sounding way of saying that this is when we're going to get all of the gospel readings that we don't like, where Jesus is saying, stop living the way you're living, I want you to live this way instead. And we go, why? So that's the season that we are in. Now today's text isn't quite in that vein, but it's definitely a stark reading as we put it over and against Father's Day. Probably wondering, where is Pastor Matt going with Father's Day on this? But it's also just a couple of years into the national observance of Juneteenth, as we are here on the 19th of June. There's a lot of things kind of intersecting as we look at this text. And I want to talk about, to start with, just some of the basic components of it. For some reason this year, I got tripped up on this weird word, swineherd. Can you picture that? All those stories where you have the swineherd out there with their, flock, herd of swine, making them go. I can't picture that. I've seen in other translations, keeper of pigs, but I'm trying to remember those stories where they said, I'm going to take the pigs out to the better pasture. Is that a thing? I don't even know. But we have this stark image that Jesus is not in his regular place. So as a Jewish rabbi, Jewish rabbis are often found around Jewish people. But that's not today's story, and the pigs highlight that sense. Jesus is across the sea, and he is in a land of Gentiles. And he experiences this amazing story about this man who is chained in the tombs. Now, there are some things that I think are worth remembering in this. We often read these stories and we hear these fantastic stories about demons and unclean spirits and all of this kind of business. And I don't think that this language is necessarily wrong, but I think at times with our modern ears, we think of it as a fictional time and place somewhere else. And I don't know that that's accurate either. All of us have been places where we have walked past people on the sidewalk or seen people in town or elsewhere who are talking to themselves. We've seen that. We know that. I was reading a story this last week in the New York Times. It was a story about the state of New York, but it could have been anywhere. And it was following the story of a family with a 13-year-old girl. They had adopted this girl as an infant, and she was their only child. And it turned out that she had rather severe autism. And at 13 years of age, she was 6'2", 250 pounds. The parents had been taken to the emergency room with concussions and other injuries as they sought to deal with their child and the issues that they were wrestling with. And the story of this article was about this small subset of the population that has no resources to deal with these kind of extreme situations. This idea that we get to the end of our ropes, even with people that we love, right? Where it becomes dangerous for us and for them. Well, let's segue to this man in the story here, right? We can imagine somebody who struggled through life, struggled in a way that became a hazard to those around him, but also, I think at times we can't give those folks too much of a pass, because sometimes when we are pressed, it's not our best self that shows up always, is it? I've got this idea. How about we chain him up in the tombs? Yikes. But we all know stories like that. Throughout history, we can think probably even in our own families, the extended family members that we seek to avoid a little bit because they're difficult, it's hard, and maybe our best self doesn't come out in those situations. And so here we have this man struggling. And in the gospel text, when we see Jesus run into somebody with an unclean spirit, or someone who is lame or blind, or in need of forgiveness, it's not unusual for the same Greek verbs to be used, where Christ is seeing that something is amiss and heals without distinction for what ails the person. In this text, we have this rather kind of outlandish situation that's going on. Someone who is chained, but then becomes released. So we think of Juneteenth. I've been amazed learning more about this story because I love history, and I'm mindful that as I look back at my education through my middle school and high school and college years, the stories that were omitted from my history classes. And in some ways, it feels like kind of going to your annual physical with your doctor and not being honest about your family medical history, right? The extent to which we are not honest about our own history doesn't allow us to be our best selves, our healthiest selves. And so when we think of this idea that there has been freedom, and yet for months, the news did not get to certain places. This idea of freedom delayed, right? And so when we think of this man chained and unable to live his life because of things that he was wrestling with, he comes to Jesus and knows who he is. A common theme in the Gospels of the unclean spirits, that they know Jesus, Son of the Most High. And Jesus finally heals the man. Now, do you notice what happens in this text? He heals the man. The swineherds, a word I'm sure you'll use this week, are a little frustrated. They've lost their whole herd, not flock, herd of sheep are all gone. They go into town. They tell everyone what's happened, and everybody gets excited, throws a party. No. They say, hey, buddy, keep moving. Keep moving. You've upset the status quo. We had things kind of figured out, and now you've upset things. Or if we think of it maybe in a more nuanced fashion, we can imagine people in town saying, we've seen other chapters with this man where it seemed like he was better and he was not, and people got hurt. We can imagine a very complicated situation. But the piece that I want to leave you with here is that this is a classic story of Jesus healing somebody, and you'll notice that the healing is not the end of the story. It could be that the story simply ends with him being healed. They have a meal, and he goes on his way. But instead, there is this sense of task, a sense, perhaps most profoundly, of being returned to his community and his place in that community. That is the ultimate healing act of Christ, is to return that person to their place in their family and community. That's not easy. Think of all of the wounds, emotional and otherwise, within that community. We hear that expressed in the keep moving, keep walking, Jesus. But the image today is one of chains being broken, a man being released and healed and returned. I think that's the kind of work that we are called to be about. But the part of the story that I want us to linger on as we move from worship into our lives this week is if we put our feet in the shoes of the people in town, the people that knew that man, the people that see him coming back, how can we become the better, graceful people in those situations? Because though the story may sound fantastic, this could be every day now. Amen.